Well, yeah, thanks so much for the invite. It's really good to be here. So I'm going to talk about psychosocial hazards, and there's been growing attention given to psychosocial hazards, as you would know. I want to argue that industrial relations really affects the existence and the impact of these hazards. And it's really important as well to see psychosocial hazards in their broader context. So, we live in a neoliberal environment where there's growing inequality, as well, unfortunately, declining union strength. And so this, really affects the existence of and how impactful psychosocial hazards are. So psychosocial hazards are intimately connected with power relations at work. There's something that for industrial relations researchers that, we've talked about for years and years, but not calling them psychosocial hazards. Talking about things like workload, like shifts, conditions, and so forth. So what I'm going to talk about in this keynote is psychosocial hazards and their outcomes, just to start with. Then look at how industrial relations affects psychosocial hazards. Then I'll look a little bit at job insecurity and fly in, fly out work in mining, sort of as case studies. Obviously, you can't do a tour of every industry or every psychosocial hazard in a talk like this, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to bring your own experiences to this. But those two things are something that I've kind of looked at a bit. And then I want to discuss psychosocial hazards and the link with physical injury and physical hazards, and then kind of sum up by what to do, what is to be done. So psychosocial hazards. So one of the classic definitions is that they are aspects of work design and the organisation and management of work and their social and environmental contexts, which have the potential for causing psychological, social, or physical harm. So I like to think of psychosocial hazards as anything in the design, management, or organisation of work that can cause stress, which can then lead to both physical and mental ill health. So there's a lot of different kind of lists of psychosocial hazards. This is kind of a classic one from Stavrula Leka and colleagues in 2010, which I quite like because it's got sort of the overarching kind of category of hazard, if you like, on the left, and then sort of broken down more on the right. So things like, job content can involve things like meaningless work, the underuse of skills. We've got workload and work pace, which is sometimes known as job demands. So work overload is, just a massive issue in many, many industries. Time pressure. So, work intensification. Work schedule, so shift work, very important psychosocial hazard. Control, and again, this is something, that really kind of comes down to power relations at work. So low participation in decision-making is a psychosocial hazard. Environment and equipment, so inadequate equipment, poor environmental conditions, so poor lighting, and so forth. Then organisational culture and function, so poor communication, poor levels of support, and things like, authoritarian management practices. Interpersonal relationships at work, so social and physical isolation, a very big issue in FIFO, bullying and harassment, which I'm not going to talk so much about, but huge issue there. Role in organisation, so role conflict, career development, job insecurity. Interestingly, is mentioned as a psychosocial hazard, even in this definition from 2010. A bit of a controversial one, but I would argue it is absolutely a psychosocial hazard. And then the homework interface, so conflict between work and home. So when researchers are kind of asking people about these hazards for surveys and interviews, they'll ask things like, so for job control, how much can you decide the pace of work and how you do the work? For job demands, they'll ask questions around, how often do you skip lunch? How often do you take work home? There's a concept of job strain, which is the kind of combination of demands and control. So you experience low job strain, when you have low demands but a high degree of control over how you do the work. And obviously high strain is the complete opposite. So interestingly, and perhaps contrary to what gets portrayed, organisational characteristics most highly associated with stress are concentrated at the bottom of the occupational hierarchy. So it's not CEOs, it's not senior managers, that can talk about stress, but they actually have a high level of control of their work. No, it's actually sections of blue-collar workers with monotonous work, machine-based, physically dangerous, demanding and routine jobs that don't have control. This is where you get very high levels of stress. And then emotional demands as well, which Owen mentioned. So, dealing with angry customers and traumatic events. Again, I'm not going to talk about those so much in this presentation, or a little bit. So this slide is just to kind of look at, because it's all, sort of pretty negative, psychosocial hazards. But if you look at psychosocial factors, workplaces can be good or bad. So looking at it at a continuum, what we're aiming for, what we're fighting for, is decent work, where workplace relationships are supportive, where workloads are manageable, where workers get given, meaningful work to do, where workers have some control over their work, and where work life, rather than being in conflict, there's a sense of balance. So that end of the spectrum is supportive of well-being. So psychosocial hazards, have some very serious health outcomes. These span both mental health and physical health. So on the kind of mental health side of things, there's burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, and depression. For physical health, psychosocial hazards can lead to musculoskeletal disorders and cardiovascular disease. And beyond the individual, there's organisational outcomes as well. So lower engagement, organisational commitment, and job satisfaction. In terms of some of the effect, I've just got some of this from the ACTU Work Shouldn't Hurt report, which Julia, wherever she is, directed me to. People probably familiar with it, but quite alarming actually statistics, I think, about workplace injury and illness. So more than one in four workers got an injury at work. So that's 7% physical injury, 17% mental health, and there's a gendered profile to the outcomes of occupational health and safety. So for women, the issues tend to be a lot of psychosocial things such as traumatic events, standing for long hours, repetitive tasks. For men, there's more of more on the physical health side, so exposure to harmful chemicals, work at heights, and so forth. Bullying, 1 in 4 workers witnessed bullying in the last 12 months. And this is more common for those under 35 years. So again, you see those power dynamics that, younger workers can be seen as easy targets, can have less experience in standing up for their rights, less likely to be in a union, and so forth. And then alarmingly, this last point of this overview is that those who reported an injury due to work didn't necessarily take time off work. Whether that be because of their job insecurity, being too busy at work, confidence, whatever it is. So a a pretty horrific kind of picture. And not on the slides, but I did just want to make mention of what in many ways is an epidemic, which is suicide. So over 5,000 suicides a year in Australia. The latest research is saying that at least 10% of them are work-related. So you think like huge numbers of people, dying due to suicide. And that's why, I think we need a really broad approach to work health and safety, and thinking about it, not just as injuries and incidents at work, but thinking about the right of workers to health, broadly defined. Some UK statistics, so stress, depression and anxiety, 1,400 cases per 100,000 workers. And we see the main causes of that as these psychosocial hazards. So role uncertainty or job conflict, the other term for it, lack of control, lack of support, changes at work, violence and threats of bullying. So again, according to the research by Phil James and David Walters, this confirms that high job demands and a lack of balance between effort and rewards, and a lack of autonomy and control can lead to a stress response with long-term health consequences. Now, psychosocial hazards and their outcomes are complex, so they can be hard to see, because they're often less visible or even invisible compared to other risk outcomes. They're highly individualized. People often experience them, themselves as an individual. They can be cumulative and interactive. So just, add up over, long periods of time. And the time between exposure, if you want to kind of use that term, and outcome isn't straightforward. So it's complex, but for all of that, it is very real, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed. So how does industrial relations impact psychosocial hazards? If you just take this quote, and there's a million more quotes you could have picked, but about a cafe worker with I think the pseudonym Claudia, from the United Workers Union, and their submission around job insecurity. So this quote is looking at how because of the job conditions, because of insecure work, which is also a psychosocial hazard, there is less ability to speak up around wage theft, but also abuse at work and sexual harassment, because if you do, you fear losing your job. And, as we know, casual workers can be sacked with an hour, 4 hours notice. So there tends to be, and, perhaps this is starting to dissipate, but there tends to be a real firewall between industrial relations and work health and safety, both in academic research. So, there's a discipline of industrial relations over here, there's discipline of work health and safety over there, but also in practice, and this separation gets reinforced by the medical and legal infrastructure. And as well as this, as well as this, Michael Quinlan, who's a real kind of giant in this field, and whose research kind of spans industrial relations, labour history, and work health and safety. He's pointed out that safety gets talked about largely as unsafe behaviour and rule breaking. So at the individual level and at the level of blaming the worker, and it's like all the kind of meditation and wellness programs that Owen alluded to before. Again, this is individual solutions, right? But then management can, this is kind of convenient for a lot of management, a lot of organisation, because then it becomes about the individual. It becomes about blaming the worker, or about, giving the worker more training in resilience or this kind of thing, and not about the broader context of job insecurity, work intensity, and so on, which can cost money, frankly. it shouldn't matter because we all deserve decent work, but for a lot of bosses, it does. So looking now for a minute, so I'm not really sure what's happening in these slides. Looking for a minute at insecure work. So, really any work arrangement where job security is an issue. So casual work, labour hire, gig workers, sham contracting, fixed term contracts. Around 3 million Australian workers lack job security. There could actually be better statistics on this, but it's a huge number of people. So many psychosocial hazards are intrinsic to insecure employment or very common in it. So if you think back to that slide of the kind of 10 overarching psychosocial hazards, so unpredictable hours and work schedule, hazard 3. Well, 53% of casuals actually have fluctuating hours from one pay cycle to the next. Lack of control over work and participation in decision making. In my industry, in academia, casual academics just basically get completely excluded. From meetings, from email lists, from anything. There's no career paths. Work underload and overload. So if you're insecure. In insecure work, you can work harder to keep the job or to try to move to permanent. And harassment and bullying. Going back to the slide, from Claudia about not feeling able to speak up about that. And then the effects of these: higher injury rates and worse injuries, worse physical and mental health, high risk of heart disease. So it can be incredible for some people to think about, but these real physical outcomes of insecure work and of psychosocial hazards. High likelihood of depression, more unwanted sexual advances at work, and then we see that the rates of insecure work are higher among already disadvantaged groups. So a compounding effect. Also wanted to look at fly-in, fly-out work. This was what, part of what I did my PhD research on. So, fly-in, fly-out workers have 12-hour shifts for 2 or even 3-week swings, and have psychosocial hazards such as isolation, exhaustion, family estrangement, and sexual harassment. And, the sexual harassment has really, come to light in the last couple of years, and just, absolutely disgusting, rates of sexual harassment in that industry. What we see in the Pilbara iron ore industry in FIFO work is very little worker voice, because union membership is extremely low. It was, the unions were smashed in the 80s and 90s in the Pilbara. And there's effectively no union delegates, because the management culture is so authoritarian that people don't want to put their hands up to be union delegates for fear of losing their job. So in this context, that's the context for health and safety and psychosocial hazards in mining, in a lot of mining in WA. In terms of mental health for FIFO workers, the issues are quite well known. There's frequent research projects. There's frequent parliamentary inquiries. As I mentioned, so I'm part now of the new Mental Awareness, Respect and Safety Centre at ECU, the Mars Centre, which is looking at mining health and safety. But a lot of previous inquiries and research tend to ignore industrial relations and look at the mental health of FIFO workers in isolation. But I just don't think you can separate it from that context. Some of the outcomes: psychological distress for FIFO workers 2 to 3 times out of the general population. But look at this next one: the likelihood is increased by a factor of 4 when workers feel very or extremely stressed by their immediate supervisors. So management culture, company strategy, and the lack of union presence, can really potentially affect workers being negatively impacted in this way by their supervisors. But if work intensity were lower and managers perceived as fair, or alternatively workers confident to collectively stand up to managers, these feelings of stress can be reduced. And just in terms of the sexual harassment in FIFO, the Enough is Enough report really just lays it all out there for the world to see, but argued that sexual harassment was generally accepted or overlooked. And one I particularly want to draw out is this horrific example of a Rio Tinto supervisor demanding sex from a woman contractor in return for being offered direct employment. This, just an absolute abuse of power. You see the interconnection of issues of power, insecure work, and sexual harassment. So the next section, I just want to talk about the link between psychosocial hazards and physical hazards and physical injury. So the reason I want to do this is because often psychosocial hazards just get talked about as mental health at work, and it's not. That's part of it, but there's a relationship with I guess the physical side of things in two ways. So firstly, psychosocial hazards cause physical health outcomes, but also in workplaces where there's a terrible culture around psychosocial hazards, there can be physical injuries. Then you think of things like fatigue that are both psychosocial and physical hazards. So you think about pressure to work fast. So Michael Quinlan and colleagues have come up with a kind of model called the pressure, disorganisation and regulatory failure model for looking at psychosocial hazards. So the pressure is economic pressure and pressure to work faster because of company profits essentially. A study by New Zealand academics Zoe Port, Kate Blackwood and David Tappan basically investigated prosecutions for physical incidents. Great little study. Looked at kind of 400 pages of, I think it was like 30 prosecutions for physical incidents. And they went through, read the reports and said, okay, well, what psychosocial factors are here? Well, all cases had at least two different psychosocial factors present. So the most common ones were environment and equipment and organisational culture and function. But then there were also issues around lack of training, job insecurity and other psychosocial factors. There was a Norwegian study by Johannessen and colleagues which found that 3 psychosocial hazards, high job strain, high emotional demands, and high role conflict were significant predictors of occupational injury. And this is a really kind of rigorous study. I'm not a quantitative person, but essentially they took 600 people, interviewed them, and then looked at them 3 years later, interviewed them again, and looked at the occupational injuries. And when they kind of crunched the numbers, they found that for 17% of those injured, physically injured with time off work, that this could be attributed to high emotional demands. A study in Korea, Kim et al., Kim and colleagues looked at high job strain and found a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of occupational injuries. And then Swain and colleagues found a 2.5 times higher risk of occupational injuries for workers with high emotional demands. So it's far from just being about mental health. All right, so to start to wind up. So what to do about psychosocial hazards and the importance of trade unionism and health and safety representation. So I'm going to start with this. Okay, so the hierarchy of controls. So this is, I'm not sure if people have seen this, but thought this was quite good. Also, if people want the slides, I can arrange to send them around as well. So that's fine. But so it's essentially taking the hierarchy of controls for physical hazards and then modifying it for psychosocial hazards. So instead of substituting the hazard, you can redesign work. Instead of isolating and engineering the hazard, you can make adjustments to existing practices, come up with safer alternatives, or for things like high workload, you can put on more staff. And then so you see the line there, change the work. So that's the optimal, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here. The very suboptimal is changing the worker. So I'm not sure if people can see, but under change the worker, it's about educating workers, just training them. Obviously, that's important as well. But if that's the only thing that you're doing, it's just not going to work. And then right at the bottom is things like resilience training. But unfortunately, the things that are a lot easier for a lot of managements, a lot of organisations, and the things that they do are right at the bottom of this hierarchy. Now, there's actually a lot of research that says that good work health and safety is good for business. That it is actually financially better for the business, and there's a sort of, I guess, small but growing amount of literature that says that this also relates specifically to psychosocial factors. And yet, a lot of businesses are not doing this. And so, full disclosure, I'm a Marxist and a trade unionist. My view as to why organisations don't tend to do this is because there's a short-term economic pressure on them, and short-term competition between organisations for profits means that they're always looking at the short term. They're always, counting their pennies and counting the cost. And so even measures that would be good for work health and safety would be good for psychosocial hazards and not taken because of that short-term mentality. You don't have to agree with that. That's my view. But like I say, there is a lot of literature out there that says that good work health and safety is good for business. So the role of unions and worker representatives, like I've been saying, workers can be scared to speak up, and the presence of psychosocial hazards is intimately connected to power relations at work. So trade unions have an absolutely crucial role to play in improving psychosocial safety. This includes the enforcement of rights under enterprise agreements or awards and health and safety legislation and codes. For me, the way that trade unionists do that is more or less a tactical kind of decision, which avenue you pursue. Sometimes the enterprise agreement's going to be better. Sometimes the work health and safety legislation is going to be better. But having rights on paper and having laws that are good mean nothing if you don't have trade unionists on the ground, delegates on the ground, and HSRs on the ground to ensure that they are enforced. And then ultimately, I think we need to aim to create workplaces where there are fewer and less severe psychosocial hazards. There's a whole body of research that shows that unionised workplaces are safer workplaces. Bobby Oliver, who's in the room, has done some, Michael Quinlan, but across countries, looking at it historically, looking at it today, being in a unionised workplace makes things safer. And trade unions have been fighting for work health and safety, including what we now call psychosocial hazards, really since the 1800s in Australia, really since unions first were formed. At a macro level, unions push for legislation, like we've heard, and on the job and at an industry level, unionists fight for better conditions. And, like I say, sometimes that's in the EBA. That can be around shifts, around workload. The United Workers Union has even gone on strike in warehouses to force the company to have more permanent jobs. Really interesting stats around. I wish I had the graph. Anyway, if you want to look it up, it's Dollard and Nessa. But national level union density in the European Union is positively related to workplace psychosocial safety climate. So psychosocial safety climate is essentially like how good is the workplace? How good is it to work? So it measures the level of demand, so work pressure, the level of resources, so autonomy and even wages, and then social relational aspects of work, so harassment. Essentially you can statistically say where there's more union density that there's better workplaces. And then in terms of HSRs, and obviously there's a strong crossover between HSRs and union delegates. There's a strong correlation, and this is from the Work Shouldn't Hurt survey report. Strong correlation between HSRs being present and health and safety compliance and culture. So 78% of workers last year with an HSR at their workplace said that their workplace complies with its own policies. Wouldn't it be nice if all our workplaces complied with their own policies? Compared to 50% of workers with no HSR present. And then committees as well are positively linked to employee compliance. And it makes sense. I'm not sort of up here lecturing you as some kind of expert. What I'm hoping to do is give you, perhaps some new information or a new kind of angle on things and backed up by academic research. But you guys are actually the experts. You guys are the subject matter experts, and what goes on every day in the workplaces. And so, HSRs are more likely to know how to report mental health injuries, mental health risks. And obviously there's more HSRs in workplaces where the respondent was a union member. Okay, so just finally, so this is the context that we find ourselves in terms of the union movement. That union density has, and I think if you go even further back, it's even worse. But in 1982, 1 in 2 workers was a union member. Today, it is 1 in 8, 12.5%. So we've seen a decline in union density, and we've also seen it's not just about membership, but it's about active unionism. So we've seen a decline in the number of union delegates and in active union workplaces. Again, not everyone's going to agree with this, but that's fine. In the trade union movement, we have discussions and debates and different opinions. But I think that to rebuild a strong trade union movement, we need to return to a more militant strategy of trade unionism that recognises the counterposed interests of workers and bosses, and that looks to the industrial power of workers and is prepared to utilise the strike weapon. And if you look at the reduction in working days lost, the reduction in strikes, it actually maps, fairly well against the reduction in union membership. So actually, when you look at a macro level, there are times in Australia's history where there was a lot more strikes. So, the 1970s in particular, there was a lot more union power, a lot more union members. But even at a micro level, when trade unions are taking strike action, are having big industrial campaigns, they sign up members. So at the University of Melbourne, just a couple of weeks ago, there was actually a 7-day strike, unprecedented 7-day strike across the whole university. In the month before that, the union branch signed up a couple of hundred union members. Thanks. Okay, so just a few acknowledgements. Dr. Zoe Port, a colleague I work with in New Zealand, who's a fantastic trade unionist and excellent in the work health and safety sphere. Michael Quinlan, who possibly some of you know, but yeah, it'd be great to get him out to do a talk, an absolute giant in the field. And Tim Bentley, Professor Tim Bentley from ECU, who introduced me to psychosocial hazards in the first place. So just to, I'll leave you with this takeaway message. I've got all the boring references at the end, so if you do want to get the slides and look anything up, you can. But psychosocial hazards are not just about mental health. It's relevant to physical health and injury. It is intimately connected with power relations at work. Industrial relations are absolutely relevant to the discussion and practice regarding psychosocial hazards, and strong unions and health and safety representation is absolutely crucial to outcomes, and there's a whole body of research on that historically and today. So do not underestimate the importance of your role. Thanks.